In 2019, Stockfish, the top chess computer, lost a game of chess against Leelenstein, another chess computer. Leelenstein is named after Frankenstein, the monster, and in this game, Leelenstein certainly lived up to its name. Let's take a look at this brilliancy, where Leelenstein starts the game off with the move d4, Stockfish plays e5, and we go into the Italian game. Now, I won't spend too much time on theory, because it's boring, but I will say that here White comes up with a plan of playing the move c3 and d4 to try to take the center, and Stockfish here allows White to get a big center, but opts to develop their bishop here on the g7 square, and instead try to pressure the center from afar. So after the opening phase of the game, just these couple of moves, here we see Black putting the bishop here, and White finally playing the move d4 to get this nice big center. Now, it may seem like this pawn is simply hanging on e4, but if pawn takes with knight, there's no crazy tactic that wins the game, but essentially White can win the pawn back because after takes and something like this, the rook is going to be able to pressure down the e-file, and because Black hasn't castled yet, White will be able to win back the pawn with a slight advantage. So instead of taking this pawn, Black decides they should probably castle first, and so they play the move queen to e7, eventually preparing to castle. So rook to e1 to support the center, d6, and Black is finally able to castle. Okay, what is happening? Well, h3 first to prevent the bishop from pinning the knight to the queen, very sensible, and so Stockfish decides to put the bishop on b7 instead if it cannot go to g4. Okay, knight to d2, and here a pawn capture in the center. Now this is very important for later in the game because after White recaptures and the bishop goes to b7, Leelenstein does have a bit of a weakness on the b4 square. And exactly what you see now is after the pawn attacks the knight is forced to move. And here, this knight is somewhat annoying to the white position, and you cannot really kick it out. If you do absolutely nothing in this position, say you randomly move your king, unfortunately this knight will stay glued in your position absolutely forever. So you really don't want to allow that. And if your pawn was on a2, you could simply kick it out, but you already committed your pawn to a4. So what is White supposed to do here? Well, of course, you can play the move a5 yourself. And by playing a5, Black is unable to keep the knight on this square forever, and if they take, they just have a horrible pawn structure, and if Black does nothing, now you're threatening the move a6. And of course, the computer loves this because you're suffocating Black and they have basically no moves, and you simply have more space and activity. Okay, so what can Black do here? Well, they play the move, instead of moving their king randomly to the corner, they play the move a6 themselves, preparing to play the move b5 and hitting the bishop. So instead of doing this, rook to a4 is played by Leelenstein, attacking the knight, and now if you try to fork both the rook and the bishop, you simply take the knight, and after pawn captures bishop, rook captures bishop. If you count the material, White is up a piece. So, of course, Stockfish does not blunder into this, and instead, in this position after the move rook to a4, what happens is the move c5. And here now the knight is being glued by Stockfish into the center, and this knight is going to be quite annoying. But Leelenstein comes up with a plan to get into a better position. Here, Leelenstein takes the pawn on b6, and after this knight comes back to try to capture it, the bishop retreats all the way back to the f1 square. Now, this is quite smart because after the knight captures the pawn here, the rook moves back, and here Leelenstein realized that this knight here on the b6 square is a bit too powerful, so by retreating the bishop, we can now move the knight to the c4 square to try to trade out this strong knight. So after the king moves, the knight opts to c4, and here after a trade, White is simply slightly better simply because they have two pawns at the center, and the bishop on b7 isn't very strong right now. Okay, so what can Black do and what can White do? Well, let's see. a5 by Stockfish, simply trying to take space and keep more control over this knight. Okay, b3 by White, and the reason for b3 is that you probably want to develop this bishop on c1 because you haven't moved it yet, but if you develop it too early, you will simply be hanging the pawn on b2 because of the bishop that Stockfish placed on g7 all that time ago. So you do not want to blunder, so playing b3 allows you to move your bishop. Okay, rook to e8. Now here comes bishop to f4. As I said, now you can develop this bishop, and the queen moves back to f8. You're like, why is the queen going back here? Well, the queen is potentially preparing the move f5 to try to attack the white position. Okay, well, Leelenstein does not really like this, so it firstly attacks the rook to try to make the rook move away. The rook moves away, and then it plays the move g4. And this is quite an aggressive move, because not only does it try to disallow this move, because now there's more pawns that could recapture here, but also there's potentially an attack against the black king with this pawn advancing into the position. Okay, so this bishop retreats to put pressure on these two pawns here. Now, if you ever move a pawn, it's always a possibility to get captured. Maybe this comes at some point to try to put pressure, maybe in the far future. And what happens is this bishop simply retreats, and the queen decides, okay, f4 is probably a bit too, let's say, ambitious, and so they decide to simply move back here and try to play on. Okay, king to h2, very normal move. You're simply trying to improve your king. The queen slides over and attacks the bishop, and from here, everything explodes in this chess game. Okay, now the most natural looking move here is queen to e2, because otherwise there's a pretty big threat against the white position. If you were to move your bishop immediately, what happens is that bishop to b2, and your rook is actually trapped, because the knight protects a2, the bishop protects a1 and a3, so the rook would be forced to move here, and here after the move bishop to d7, your rook is simply trapped. So, of course, the most natural thing to do in this position would be, instead of simply retreating your bishop back right away, you could play the move queen to e2, because now you're protecting your bishop, and there's never any idea of bishop to b2 because the queen actually guards that square. But what happens in the game is that Leelenstein sacks its rook by putting the bishop on c4. It allows its rook to be trapped for a fantastic reason. It wants to attack the black king. The rook moves up, and the bishop is now attacking the rook. Stockfish is like, free rook, I will take it. Queen to d2. Now, after the rook is taken, you do not take the light squared bishop. You have to take the dark squared bishop, like what Leelenstein did. Now, the point is that black has a lot of weak squares around its king. Now, if you were to take the light squared bishop, the dark squared bishop could protect the dark squares around the king, but because you've just taken the dark squared bishop, the dark squares around the king are actually quite weak, and so Leelenstein thinks that this bishop is worth more than a rook. So the bishop retreats, and queen to f6. The queen slides all the way over, putting pressure on the black position. And here Stockfish plays the move rook to d7. Now, the point of this is to overprotect the pawn on f7, because if the queen in this position ever tries to move anywhere, you're going to lose the pawn on f7 and the game. So by overprotecting the pawn, you can now allow your queen to move anywhere it wants to. Okay, here bishop to f4 is played, simply trying to set up an attack against the black king. And here Stockfish blunders the game away with the move bishop takes bishop. You can pause the video here if you want to solve this position for yourself, but I'm going to reveal it right now. Now, this is a crazy move. It is bishop takes h6. This wins the game on the spot. Now, this is a crazy move because you're not recapturing the bishop. You're sacrificing so much material here. You're hanging this and you're allowing black to escape, but it is all over. Now, the reason it's all over is because you're threatening checkmate on g7 if black does nothing. And let's just look at what happens if you don't take the sacrifice first. Okay, let's say you bring your rook over here, trying to stop checkmate. Bishop to d2 wins. This is a crazy move. You're just seemingly moving your bishop away, but what you're actually doing is freeing up the queen to give a check to the king. So despite whatever black decides to play, not there, the queen will go to h4 with check, force the king to move, the bishop will enter with check, and notice that the king has to go to one of these two squares, and then it will be checkmate. This is quite fantastic. So you really have to take this sacrifice after the move bishop takes here. Okay, so instead of moving the rook here, you really have to take, otherwise you're just going to get checkmated. Knight to h4. Knight to h4 is the next move of this attacking sequence. The threat here is if black does absolutely nothing, the knight will come to f5, checking the king. Pawn cannot take because you're pinned. The king will be forced back, and this will simply be checkmate. This is a brilliant idea that Stockfish either underestimated or did not see. And so the problem here is that if you again try to defend with your rook trying to stop this square, what's going to happen is knight to f5 check anyways, the king will move back and the queen will get checkmated. So what can black even do in this crazy position? Well, what they have to do is they have to Stockfish believes the position is so bad they should just sacrifice their queen here, taking the pawn. So Stockfish decides to sacrifice their queen for just a pawn to defend their king, but this is not really anything any human would do. You're just accepting that you've lost the game. And so probably the most natural try would be to try to run the king back, trying to run away. But now knight to f5 anyways, and the game is still lost. You have to stop this checkmate, and so you really have to take the knight here. And after pawn takes knight, pawn takes, despite being down 9 points of material, there's a crushing attack against the black king because there is no pieces defending the king. All the pieces are on the wrong side of the board. If these pieces were all over here, black would be fine, but it's not. There's a huge attack. So here what happens is that in this position, let's say that black tries to run. Unfortunately, rook to g1 check. The king is forced to move, and after queen to h1 check, we get h8 check. We have a pawn checkmate with f6. Okay, so what else can black try to do? Well, it's pretty hopeless, but if you try to, let's say you just make some random move, you're just going to put your rook on g1, and basically there's a bunch of different things that black could try, but all of them lead in checkmate simply because the king is too weak, and this pawn here and this queen and this rook will hunt down the king. Okay, so let's look at what actually happened in the game when the queen decided to sacrifice itself for the pawn. Pawn takes, bishop goes here to guard itself, and then over the next course of 20 moves, essentially white simply does a great conversion here, winning some pawns, putting pressure on the black position, and we'll simply skip to the end right now. This is the ending that Leelenstein ended up with. In this position, Leelenstein sacrifices its knight because after knight takes knight, here the king attacks the knight, and if the knight tries to stop the pawn, the king will go capture the knight, move back, and make a new queen. And if you do not simply move the knight away, and if you move the knight away to anywhere, we will make a new queen. And that's exactly what happens. The knight moves, a queen is made, and in just a few short moves, the game is over. Thank you for watching this video. Subscribe for more crazy attacks like this one.